I have to, of course, start by saying I'm so grateful to Maitree and the Toronto City Summit Alliance with the support of the Government of Ontario for making this possible. And it's the Diverse City Project, not just the piece that we're involved in, but the Diverse City Project, from my perspective, is one of the smartest, most effective integrated strategies I've seen addressing a very specific problem. So I really think the founders need to be commended. I also have to tell you that it takes a village to write this report, and I was very ably supported by my colleague, Professor John Miller from Ryerson University, Margaret Yap, who's not here today, Pinu Bindani, the Associate Director of the Diversity Institute, and our silent partner, Sandra Lopes from Maitree, in preparing this report, along with an army of graduate students, undergraduate students, and researchers who helped collect the data. For those of you who weren't here last year, who haven't read the previous reports, I just want to remind you of the scope. Our focus in the DiverseCity Counts project is on the 5 municipalities in the GTA which have the highest visible minority representation: Toronto, Brampton, Mississauga, Markham, and Richmond Hill. Those communities represent almost 3/4 of the GTA population and have a population which is 50% visible minority. We looked at the same sectors and institutions this year as we reviewed last year. I'll talk more about that later. And this year we added a special analysis of the media. So I don't think I need to talk to you about this point. I'd be preaching to the converted, and I think Mr. Torrey did a very able job of reminding us of the business case for diversity. The business case for diversity applies whether you're in the corporate sector, the nonprofit sector, or government. And this year, we looked again at 6 sectors. We looked at elected officials, we looked at government employees in the public sector, both municipal and provincial. We looked at the corporate sector, the largest companies in the GTA. We looked at the voluntary sector, the largest charities and foundations in the GTA. We looked at the education sector, the school boards, the colleges, and the universities in those communities mentioned, and we looked at government agency boards and commissions in the City of Toronto and at the provincial level. And if you look at the orange line, which is 2010 this year, compared to the blue line, which is the data from last year, you'll see in most of these sectors there isn't a huge change. If we look at elected officials, if we look at the public sector, the corporate sector, the voluntary sector, and the education sector, the differences last year compared to this year are relatively minor. The one place we see significant change is in government agencies, boards, and commissions. And remember, we looked at the City of Toronto and we looked at the Province of Ontario, and there we see an increase from 18.6% to 22.3%. The overall conclusions from this report is that change is slow but moving in the right direction. And quite honestly, we did not expect in the course of 1 year to see much change. The change that we see overall, 13.5% up to 14%, really is accounted for in the progress we've made in agencies, boards, and commissions. And I think there is good evidence to suggest the reason why that sector is showing progress is because they have self-consciously made it a priority. And I'm quite confident that Maitree's efforts in this area have paid off. The other piece that we added this year to our study that we did not do last year was we looked in those individual sectors and we compared organizations that were what we call trailblazers to organizations that we term laggards. What we found is that the overall averages in those individual sectors, which I showed you in the previous slide, mask huge differences within the sector. We found, for example, among the leaders, over 20% of the organizations we examined had more than 20% visible minorities in their board or leadership roles. So 1 in 5 in those organizations were visible minorities. It's not as high a percentage as in the general population, but certainly that indicates movement in the right direction. At the same time, we found that more than half of the organizations we looked at, more than half the organizations we looked at this year, had zero visible minorities on their boards or in their senior management teams. That shows there's a clear opportunity for improvement and for learning from those leading organizations. I already mentioned that government ABCs have moved into the lead spot, and of course this year as last year, the corporate sector is the least diverse at 4.1%. We also, in this report, tried to highlight some leading practices, and we focused some attention on Canada's financial services sector. Not only is it significant in terms of wealth generation, but it has a high level of representation in senior roles compared to the corporate sector generally. In some banks, we've seen increases in diverse leadership in the senior-most roles by 300% over the last decade. And it's worth asking, how is it that that happened? We believe that financial services, in part because it's federally regulated and subject to employment equity legislation, has focused on this issue in a strategic way for a longer period of time than many other sectors. We know that in the financial services sector, they have clearly defined the business case for diversity. It's no secret that some of the chief economists in this country drove the business case, made the argument that if we did not more effectively include immigrants, we as a nation would lose out. In addition, we've seen tremendous leadership in many of the banks. CEOs of the large banks in Canada have been at the forefront in advocating for diversity in a variety of fora. We've seen thoughtful and coherent communications in these organizations, both within and without, and we've seen advanced human resources practices. The financial services are also starting to think about building the pipeline, and we had a meeting with one of the banks just a couple of weeks ago where they announced a deliberate effort to reach out to underrepresented groups at high school to interest them in financial occupations. But most of all, the financial services sector has been subject to measurement for several decades. Measurement does not mean setting quotas. Measurement means looking at where you are and where you want to go. And because they've been subject to employment equity legislation, financial services have been tracking different dimensions of diversity for a number of years. We would argue that the very act of measuring causes change. Because once an organization shines a light on this issue, they tend to move forward, and I'll talk more about that later. Our second year study results are not surprising. As I said, we found, and we believe that this is true, that tracking and reporting on results in and of itself leads to higher levels of diversity in leadership. The top performing organizations we identified, the banks as well as the broadcasters, both measure and publicly account for their efforts, and as I said, federally regulated companies tend to do better. This year, I mentioned, for the first time, we also looked at the media. We looked at large media corporations, and we considered specifically the business case in the media sector. As in any other sector, the same points apply. It allows the media to connect with a broader audience. Looking around this room, looking at the demographics of the GTA generally, we know that the audience for major media providers is increasingly diverse. And as in other sectors, it makes sense that your employees and your leaders will reflect the communities that you serve in order to provide better services, more relevant, more appropriate services. In addition, and John Miller, the co-author of the report, was particularly emphatic about this point, that representing more diverse people and more diverse viewpoints actually produces better journalism. My interest in the media comes in large part because of my deeply felt belief and very, very solid research that shows the media has a profound impact on who we see as leaders, on stereotypes, and on the shape of aspirations of our young people. Who we see as leaders, who we see as authorities, who we see as experts in the media has a profound impact on what we hope we can be and what we believe we can be. And that's why this part of the study is so critically important. So, what did we do? Essentially, we looked at key media programs. We looked at supper hour news in the largest broadcasters, and we added a public affairs show, The Agenda. We also looked at print newspapers. We examined the companies that own these properties, and the first step in this analysis was simply to take the same methodology we applied to the other sectors and look specifically at these organizations within the media. We looked at leaders in the board of directors, we looked at senior corporate managers, and we also looked at newsroom decision makers, producers, editors, and the like. And here's what we found. What we found is basically the media companies we examined were pretty much the same as other large organizations in the corporate sector in terms of diversity among their management and boards of directors, roughly 5%. The second piece of our study focused on the representation and content, and I have to really emphasize a caveat here. This is a snapshot. If you took a different snapshot, you might see a slightly different picture. What we did was look at a constructed week of media coverage, which is a non-sequential set of days of coverage. We looked at the supper hour broadcasts, and we looked at print. In analyzing the media, we focused on images. We focused on who is seen, who is shown. We looked at pictures. So in the broadcasts, we looked specifically at who spoke on camera, who were the hosts, who were the reporters, who were the experts, who were the background people who were interviewed for person on the street commentary. In newspapers, we looked specifically at photographs, and we looked at photographs illustrating stories, and we looked at photographs of columnists. We did not look at reporters. We did not look at reporters because we did not have easy access to that information. We also excluded, on purpose, all advertisements or paid announcements. What did we find? This may not surprise you, but again, what we found was that overall, visible minorities are underrepresented in broadcast news, in the newspapers, whether we talk about who is on camera giving expert advice, whether we talk about hosts and reporters, whether we talk about the background people, whether we talk about stock photographs. Visible minorities are underrepresented in all forms of media that we looked at. A couple of examples here, because there are, anybody who works in the media, and certainly John emphasized this, there's some stories that are not discretionary. If you're writing a story about the President of the United States, probably it's going to be a picture of Barack Obama. On the other hand, many stories have huge discretion, and one of the examples our researchers pointed to was a story about high school girls buying prom dresses. Every single person in that story was white. One of my researchers commented, "I've never seen so many white hands in my life," because most of the stock photographs that were used to illustrate use of a cell phone or operating a piece of equipment were stock photographs of white people, which do not represent the general population. So the issue of representation goes far beyond the leaders that we see represented in the media. It extends to the experts who are called upon to comment in the media, and it also extends to the people in the background shots, the people commenting on the weather, the people featured in the stories about the prom dresses. So when we look at the opportunities in the media, it's clear that emerging technologies, online media for example, provide opportunities to give a platform for new voices, for new faces. We also know that the ethnic media is growing at a phenomenal rate. There are opportunities to partner with, to share resources, to reciprocate between mainstream media and the ethnic media. We also cited a case study in the report looking specifically at Metro Morning, which took a mindful approach to adapting its programming to a growingly diverse audience with measurable impact on a huge growth in audience. And John noted that it's now one of the leading morning broadcast radio shows in the GTA. So when we look at recommendations for the media, many of our recommendations in the report point to the low-hanging fruit, point to opportunities for increasing diversity in news coverage, point to opportunities to make coverage a more accurate reflection of the community in which we all live, and give voice and a platform to more diverse experts and people. And as I said before, there are also huge opportunities for new kinds of partnerships. Back to our overall report and recommendations, and this will look familiar to some of you because these are pretty much the same recommendations that we had last year for all organizations, whether they're for-profit, non-profit, voluntary, or government or private sector. And that is to focus on the business case for diversity, because there clearly is one. And as Mr. Torrey emphasized, it applies whether you're in government, whether you're in a charity, whether you're in a large bank, or whether you're in a board. Leadership is critical. We need people to stand up and articulate the business case and why this is so important for the prosperity of individual organizations and also for the region as a whole, and indeed our nation. We have to communicate. We have to develop human resource practices which erode the barriers, the unintentional barriers that are created when people rely on informal networks, for example, to identify employees or people to promote into leadership roles. We have to develop the pipeline, thinking ahead to the next generation of leaders and employers. And fundamentally, we have to count, because what gets measured gets done. Thank you very much.